Hello everybody, in today's video we are going to be looking at Jumpstart Historic Horizons and talking about, at least in my opinion, the 10 most impactful cards from this set that are going to impact the historic metagame. Now in today's video we are simply going to be talking about the new cards. We're not going to be talking about cards that are already in there that are impactful, and we're only talking about normal historic. I'm going to be doing a video covering Historic Brawl, all of the new legendaries, stuff like that, coming up here soon, so stay tuned for that. But today we are simply talking about normal historic. Now, each of these is obviously my own opinion. If you disagree, let me know in the comments down below, hopefully in a nice way, and let me know what cards you think are going to make a big splash in the metagame. Why don't we jump right into this? By the way, these are in no particular order. It does not mean the first one I talk about is the least impactful. They are kind of just 10 really impactful cards we're going to see. So the first one is Yogmoth. So Yogmoth reads 2 and black for a legendary creature, human cleric, 2/4 with protection from humans. Then you can pay 1 life and sacrifice another creature, put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card. Then you can pay black and discard a card to proliferate. Alright, so right now in Historic, we already have decks that like to sacrifice, and I am sure those decks would love another infinite sack outlet that also is removal and card draw. Then you add on top of that the fact that you can discard cards to proliferate and speed up that removal. Yogmoth is kind of a beast. He does kind of everything that a sacrifice deck is going to want to do. He's going to want to control the opponent's side of the board while sacrificing creatures, and honestly, just the fact that this says pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, and there's no mana cost to that, I think would already make it an include in some, historic sacrifice-based decks, which are some of the most popular. And then the fact that it draws a card and puts -1/-1 counters is just amazing on top of that. So I think this card is definitely going to see play in those sacrifice-based strategies. And yeah, it's just really, really good. Next, we have Esper Sentinel. So this one is one of the ones that if I was ranking, it would be a little bit lower. So it's 1 white for an artifact creature, human soldier, 1/1. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. So this card is nuts in Commander. However, I think in Historic Brawl, it'll see a little bit more play than Historic. However, even then, it's not as powerful as something like Commander, where your opponent, it's a 1v1 format. So that means, in Commander, this is going to do a lot more work for you. However, when looking at the historic metagame, we have a couple, I don't want to say stacks decks, but decks that want to heavily control you and then also play permanents that stop you from doing things. And Esper Sentinel is just a cheap 1-drop that can go in that kind of format. I think also mono white would just like this card. And so I think there's lots of different homes where maybe it's not the all-star of the deck, but it is able to provide value. So I think there's a lot of different places this can go into. Maybe we see the return of artifact creatures mattering, and then you can boost them up. And when that happens, then you have to pay more. So I see like lots of different places this card could go, but I do think it is one of my weaker picks on the list today. Not like in all of Magic, but just in Historic. Maybe I'm completely wrong on that one, but this one I was a little bit hesitant on putting on the list, even though it is one of the most expensive cards like that has a paper version in the set. Next, we have Dragon's Rage Chandler. So this is 1 red for a creature, human shaman, 1/1. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, surveil 1. Then Delirium. As long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, it gets +2/+2, has flying and attack each combat fable. So this is another one of those cards where I feel like it can go in a lot of different places. I think if Mono Red Burn ever tries to re-emerge, this will be a great card in that. But I also feel like, currently there's a meta where there are, is it Phoenix decks where they have kind of fallen out of favor since Brainstorm goes out, but they want to fill their graveyards with, is it Phoenix? The Phoenix. They want to put that in the graveyard. Well, the Surveil one's going to help with that. You're already casting lots of non-creature spells, so you can stuff your graveyard. And then once it's stuffed, you get this 4/4 flying attacker. So I think, an Is It Phoenix deck is going to love this card. But also it's just a pretty aggressive card, and I could see maybe some, Gruul or Mono Red decks just wanting to run this card if they have a decent amount of non-creatures. For instance, again, a Mono Red Burn deck would probably really like this card. So I think this just it's very similar to Esper Sentinel where it has just a couple homes, but I do think Is It Phoenix is going to like this card a lot. Next, we have Tireless Provisioner. 2 and a green for a creature, Elf Scout. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food token or a treasure token. All right, so Lotus Cobra is a pretty good card. It doesn't see a ton of play, but this is kind of 1 mana more for another Lotus Cobra, but the mana sticks around. I'm not saying this is necessarily going to break open the metagame. I think this is, again, on the lower end of power. Very similar to Esper Sentinel, this does a lot more in Commander, and I think even Historic Brawl, but I do think that this is a very powerful card and an uncommon that will see a decent amount of play. If we see those decks that want to just ramp like crazy, this card is going to want to go in those decks, because if you can cultivate and, get 2 lands on the battlefield, the one you get in your hand and the one there, you're getting basically 3 mana back for your cultivate. Really, really good. It just does a lot of stuff in those kind of rampy decks, and we've seen that Historic really likes ramp decks, and this seems like a card that just fits perfectly with that. So I think it is definitely going to see at least a little bit of play. We have a couple other picks that I think are a little more definite than this one, but I do think this one is pretty good. Next, we have Freyalise Sky Shroud Partition. It's 1 green for a legendary Planeswalker Freyalise. It has 4 loyalty. It's a +1. Untap up to 1 target elf. That elf and a random elf creature in your hand perpetually get +1/+1. Alright, so mono green elves are already a pretty good deck in Historic, and this card is going to add a lot of punch to it. I mean, even just that +1. We have creatures that add green equal to the number of elves you control, or add green equal to their power, and they get bigger every time an elf enters the battlefield. So this card is going to love that. It's going to be able to create a ton of mana. Oftentimes you'll be playing Freyalise for free, and then just you pay 3, and then you untap the thing that generated the mana to cast Freyalise, and it's like it never happened. Plus, you're boosting your creatures. Then, say you have all this mana and nothing to do with it, -1. Go get an elf. You're not going to accidentally hit a land that you don't need. You are getting an elf. And then, if you can get up to that -6, you have a ton of elves, because you're playing elves. And -6, you're basically going to get a big creature and draw a ton of cards. Regal Force draws a card for each green creature you control when it ETBs. So, yeah, this card just seems like an auto-include in most elf decks. I assume there's going to be room in there. I don't personally run one, but this just seems like it does everything that deck is wanting to do. Boost up elves, untap them, draw cards, and that's going to do this really easily, and it's a pretty low mana value. So I think this is probably the most powerful of the 5 Planeswalkers, at least in the current Historic meta. Davriel is a close second, but I really only wanted to include one of the Planeswalkers, and I think this one has a higher shot of getting in, but Davriel does have some really big potential. However, he's a little bit luck-based, which I think kind of pulls him down. Next, we have Parallel Lives. Again, it's not a huge thing in the meta right now, but this is the kind of card that can not warp the format, but create an entire deck built around it. We have a ton of token generation effects in the game, whether they are creature-based or artifact-based even, and this is just going to allow those to kind of thrive. And so while token-based decks really haven't been able to take off, this is the kind of card that could promote them to just kind of leap ahead of the competition. Next, we have Pashlik Mon. So very similar to Freyalise for elves, I feel like this guy is going to go in a couple goblin decks. I don't think it's as obvious of a pick as Freyalise is, but when you look at the other 3-drop goblins, yes, we have some really good ones, and I don't think this is like a 4 of, but I think 2 of it maybe in a goblin deck. This is really awesome. You can maybe tutor for it when you need it. It's going to kind of let you if your board kind of gets stalled, it's going to let you turn your goblins directly into damage. And if you end up stalling late game, you're able to kind of just keep creating new goblins. So I think it's going to do something kind of interesting where your opponents don't really want to block your creatures, but they also have to. And that often creates interesting gameplay. And this is just another goblin for those goblin decks to play with. And I do think it will make the cut. It isn't a huge deal, but you're already sacrificing your goblins to add mana. You're doing all that, and so I feel like this just kind of has a place in those style of decks, and it can also be creature removal because it's any target. So if your opponent has some creature, you might be able to sack your goblins to deal damage, and so it just has that versatility that I think will push it into playability. Next, we have Sky Shroud Ambush. This is 1 and a green for an instant. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. When the creature you control wins the fight, draw a card. So this one was a last-minute addition by me, but I thought about it. I'm like, okay, so mono green decks are gonna love this. This is a removal spell that cantrips. That'd be like if black had one black, destroy target creature, draw a card. You're gonna have bigger creatures than your opponent. I feel like there are those 2 mana fight spells that don't actually fight, they just deal damage, and you could argue that's better than this because you don't have to worry about your creature dying. But the fact that you draw a card and this is instant speed. If this was sorcery speed, I would say, nah, it's not good enough. But the fact that this is an instant means that this is gonna, you're gonna be able to strike at that perfectly timed moment. And I just feel like this card should have costed 3 or been sorcery speed. I think this is actually really, really good. It doesn't appear to be super crazy, but I think it's just one of those cards that is just going to generate you a ton of value. Next, we have Seasoned Pyromancer. 1 red, red for a creature, human shaman, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, discard 2 cards, then draw 2 cards. For each non-land card discarded this way, create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. Then 3 red, red, exile it from your graveyard, create 2 1/1 red elemental creature tokens. So I think this has a couple different potential homes. This could go in something like a Reanimator deck that wants to self-mill and resurrect stuff. If you mill this away, you can just pay some mana and get some elementals, but also if you play it, you can be discarding stuff. I also think that Izzet Phoenix, again, might like this card. You know, it's basically faithless looting on a creature and then also creating other creatures, but it also isn't an instant or sorcery, so it does kind of lose out on some of that value. However, I think this is one of those cards that can go in lots of different places. This can go, in that mono red deck. For instance, it says discard 2 cards, then draw 2 cards. It doesn't say if you do. So, for instance, you could theoretically have this be the last card in your hand in a mono red deck. You play it, and you just essentially draw 2 cards. Or you could discard some cards you weren't going to use to get some 1/1. So I think this, again, this is one of those cards that can just fit in a lot of different decks as just a powerful piece, and maybe doesn't have like the quote unquote perfect home, but can add a lot of value to a lot of different decks. Next, we have Gabriels Withering. All right, this card I think is going to be played in best of 3 a ton. And that's because, I know I keep bringing up Izzet Phoenix. Izzet Phoenix gets kind of shut down by this. So the Phoenix's, Arclight Phoenix is a 3/2. And this basically kills it for 1 mana. But what it does is it leaves it with 0 toughness in the graveyard, which means when it's resurrected, it comes back and just immediately dies. Reanimation is a huge thing in Historic, and so I feel like if you can kind of take those creatures that might normally get reanimated that are a little bit lower in power and toughness, your Witch's Oven or your Cauldron Familiars, all of those, you can kind of like kill it forever without exiling it. And so 1 mana, kill it forever, something with 2 toughness or less seems really, really good. I mean, the cat, they won't be able to sacrifice it. Arclight Phoenix won't be able to come back. So I think this will be played in at least sideboards pretty regularly. I don't know how much play it'll see in main decks. However, it isn't an awful piece of removal. 1 mana to kill something with 2 toughness or less isn't, obviously the greatest, but it also isn't bad, especially considering its instant speed. And those are my picks for the top 10 most impactful cards for Historic. I actually don't think this will be as big of a change for the format. I could be horribly wrong. I do think there will be a couple new decks that form, and I do think that there will be some, new powerful staples added, but I don't know if it'll be as big as the original Jumpstart. And the only reason I say that is because when the original Jumpstart came out, it was kind of the first new set for Historic. It wasn't just standard cards anymore. It was cards that were literally only legal in Vintage and Legacy, and then some other, modern cards, Pioneer cards. And so it kind of was the first one. So it took it from a kind of just slightly above standard power level to something closer to Pioneer. So this one, yes, it is a pretty big jump, and I would say that this set has a higher power level than Jumpstart in a lot of ways, the original, but we're also already at a higher power level. So I think the jump up will not be as drastic as original Jumpstart, but I do think we are going to see those, powerful new cards that see play. Either way, I want to know what you guys think about all of this in the comments down below. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button, subscribe to see more content like this, check out my other socials in the description, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.